Dobrodošlicu na današnji webinar sa temom buka u okolišu, opšti značaj i utjecaj buke na zdravlje. Tokom današnjeg dana moći ćete čuti mnogo interesantnih informacija. Naučit ćemo nešto o iskustvima iz Europske unije i Švedske. Dakle, ovaj webinar se održava pod okriljem projekta Strategija i akcioni plan zaštite okoliša, odnosno životne sredine. Za Bosnu i Hercegovinu. Dakle, putem ovog projekta po prvi put u Bosni i Hercegovini će se strateški razmatrati tema zaštite okoliša, odnosno životne sredine, paralelno na svim nivoima vlasti. Dakle, izrađivat će se strategija i akcioni plan za nivo institucija Bosne i Hercegovine, Federacije Bosne i Hercegovine, Republike Srpske, Brčkog distrikta Bosne i Hercegovine. Još jedan značaj jeste, naročito za ovu temu, jeste to što se po prvi put i buka strateški razmatra u okviru tematike zaštite okoliša. Ovaj projekat je počeo u septembru 2019. godine i završit će se u aprilu 2022. godine. Sam projekat podrazumijeva participatorni pristup zainteresiranih strana i zapravo stručnjaci i zainteresovane strane iz institucija nevladinog sektora, biznis sektora i sektora koji je zadužen za obrazovanje i istraživanje. Dakle, stručnjaci iz tih oblasti zapravo direktno učestvuju u izradi strategije i akcionog plana po različitim temama zaštite okoliša. A različite teme koje se u okviru ovog projekta razmatraju su vode, otpad, biološka raznolikost i očuvanje prirode, zatim kvalitet zraka, klimatske promjene i energija, hemijska bezbjednost i buka, upravljanje resursima te upravljanje okolišem. Dakle, danas ovaj webinar se održava u okviru ove tematske grupe hemijska bezbjednost i buka. Moje ime je Melina Đajić-Valjevac, ja sam voditelj radne grupe hemijska bezbjednost i buka, a pored mene zajedno vodimo radne grupe moj kolega Borislav Malinović, koji će vam u nastavku predstaviti trenutno stanje u ovoj oblasti. Nakon Borislava imat ćemo vrlo interesantne prezentacije Lize Johansson iz Agencije za okoliš, odnosno životnu sredinu iz Švedske, zatim Charlotte Eriksson, Karolinska instituta također iz Švedske, te također vrlo interesantna prezentacija od gospodina Viktora Minkevića iz Rumunije. O tome ćemo čuti nešto više u nastavku. Ja samo želim da kažem da u okviru ovog webinara predviđeno je da i vi možete postavljati pitanja na koja ćemo odgovoriti kasnije, dakle kada bude panel diskusija, koristeći ovu ikonicu na dnu Q&A gdje možete postaviti pitanja i ja vas pozivam da tokom prezentacija odmah sve što imate da pitate, a prezentatori će kada dođe panel diskusija, odgovarati na ta pitanja. Ja bi sada pozvala kolegu Borislava Malinovića da vam prezentira trenutno stanje u oblasti buke u okolišu u Bosni i Hercegovini. Izvolite, Borislav.
Hvala, Melina. Dobro jutro i od mene svim učesnicima današnjeg webinara. Ja sam Borislav Malinović i zajedno sa Melinom sam moderator današnjeg webinara, a inače u projektu ESAP 2030+ učestvujem u radu radne grupe hemijska bezbjednost i buka kao kovoditelj radne grupe zajedno sa kolegicom Melinom. Inače, radim kao vanredni profesor na Tehnološkom fakultetu Univerziteta u Banja Luci. I ja ću vam shodno agendi danas samo napraviti kratak uvod u današnju tematiku i predstaviti jedan kratak presjek trenutnog stanja oblasti buke u Bosni i Hercegovini. Samo molim potvrdu od Meline, da li se vidi ekran? Ok, hvala. Kao što smo rekli, znači mi radimo u okviru radne grupe hemijska sigurnost, odnosno bezbjednost i buka, znači i borimo se sa dvije tematike, od kojih je jedna buka. U stvari naša oblast je buka iz okoliša, odnosno životne sredine, pa bih volio da vam pročitam definiciju buke i životne sredine prema Direktivi o procjeni upravljanja bukom i životne sredine Evropske unije, gdje je buka definisana kao neželjen ili po ljudsko zdravlje i životnu sredinu štetan zvuk u vanjskom prostoru izazvan ljudskom aktivnošću, uključujući buku koju emituju prevozna sredstva, cestovni promet, željeznički promet, vazdušni promet te buka iz područja sa industrijskim djelatnostima. Područje ove direktive ne pokriva buku koja izaziva sama izložena osoba, buku svakodnevnih kućanskih aktivnosti, buku iz stambenih prostora i želio bih naglasiti ne pokriva buku na radnom mjestu, buku unutar prijevoznih sredstava ili buku od vojne aktivnosti u vojnim područjima. Navedena direktiva Evropske unije nalaže sljedeće mjera, to je izrada karata buke, uključivanje javnosti i izradu akcijskih planova. O ovome će vam mnogo više reći današnji naši predavači, a ovdje desno vidite jedan screenshot sa sajta Europske agencije za zaštitu životne sredine gdje su prikazane veliki broj strateških karata buke u zemljama članicama Evropske unije. Kada govorimo o trenutnom stanju, krenut ćemo, pošto mi na projektu obuhvatamo sve 4 jurisdikcije, to je znači nivo Bosne i Hercegovine, nivo entiteta i nivo Brčkog distrikta Bosne i Hercegovine. Na BiH nivou institucionalne nadležnosti na BiH postoji samo u pogledu buke u transportu, a koju pokriva Ministarstvo komunikacije i transporta Bosne i Hercegovine, Ministarstvo vanjske trgovine i ekonomskih odnosa Bosne i Hercegovine, Regulatorni odbor željeznica Bosne i Hercegovine i Direkcije za civilno zrakoplovstvo Bosne i Hercegovine. Sve navedene institucije imaju na raspolaganju niz zakonskih i podzakonskih akata i, da kažem, to je mnogo dobro pokriveno. Međutim, u Bosni i Hercegovini, znači na nivou Bosne i Hercegovine, ne postoje izrađene karte buke, strateške karte buke, niti akcijski plan. Stanje u Federaciji Bosne i Hercegovine je nešto bolje, jer postoji na snazi zakon o zaštiti od buke, međutim to je jedini propis koji reguliše buku. Zakon ne slijedi strukturu direktive o procjeni upravljanja bukom i životne sredine i ne daje dobar pravni okvir za njeno transponovanje u pravni sistem Bosne i Hercegovine. Zakon predviđa izrade studija utjecaja na okoliš u slučaju postrojenja koje mogu proizvesti određeni nivo buke. Međutim, pregledom svih prostornih planova federacije i kantona nije ustanovljeno prisustvo izrađenih karata buke niti akcijskih planova. Stanje u Republici Srpskoj je, da kažem, nešto lošije. Buka se spominje u zakonu o zaštiti životne sredine, odnosno regulisana je tim zakonom. U članu 15 se navodi da će se posebnim propisom urediti buka koja je jedan od elemenata životne sredine, međutim, normiranje intenziteta buke se vrši sa pravilnikom koji je donesen još davne 1989. godine, pravilnikom o dozvoljenim granicama intenziteta zvuka i šuma. Zakonom također nije predviđena izrada strateških karata buke kao ni aktivnih planova u oblasti upravljanja bukom, stoga se ne raspolaže sa informacijama o postojanju aktivnosti u trenutnoj oblasti. Stanje u Brčkom distriktu je, možemo reći, slično kao i u Republici Srpskoj. Postoji zakon o zaštiti životne sredine Brčkog distrikta koji sadrži nekoliko odredaba koji se odnose na buku, a kada govorimo o emisijama buke, trenutno se primjenjuje pravilnik o dozvoljenim granicama intenziteta zvuka i šuma iz 1989. godine. Izrada karata buke i akcijskih planova također nije dio zakonske regulative u Brčkom distriktu i nismo utvrdili postojanje istih. Nakratko ću se samo osvrnuti na dosadašnje aktivnosti naše radne grupe. Imali smo održana 2 sastanka za sve jurisdikcije, pa onda mogu reći da je u stvari bilo ukupno 8 sastanaka, a unutar našeg strateškog cilja koji je već postavljen na početku projekta naše radne grupe, očuvanje ljudskog zdravlja, poboljšanje dobrobita i kvaliteta života za sve, mi smo otvrdili neki od ključnih izazova koji su manje i više slični za sve jurisdikcije koje pokrivamo, a to je nepostojanje adekvatnog zakonskog okvira kojim se reguliše pravna tekovina Evropske unije u oblasti buke u životnoj sredini, disperzija i nedovoljno jasne institucionalne nadležnosti u pogledu upravljanja bukom u životnoj sredini, nizak nivo znanja javnih službenika i javnosti utjecanjem buke na ljude i životnu sredinu, nedostatak strateškog planiranja oblasti buke u životnoj sredini. Na osnovu ovih ključnih izazova definisali smo i neke od operativnih ciljeva, a to je izrada zakonodavnog okvira kojim se reguliše EU pravna tekovina iz oblasti buke u životnoj sredini, uspostava koordinacionog mehanizma i jasne institucionalne nadležnosti u pogledu implementacije zakonodavnog okvira, usklađeno sa EU pravnom tekovinom, unapređeno strateško planiranje i monitoring buke, unapređeno znanje javnosti i unapređeni kapaciteti javnih službenika javnosti. O upravljanju bukom u životnoj sredini želim da naglasim, znači da je ovo rezultat rada radnih grupa koji imaju poprilično velik broj učesnika. I za kraj današnjeg uvoda pozvao bih sve učesnike današnjeg webinara, pošto sem članova radne grupe vjerovatno imamo i drugih učesnika, da svi pokušate doprinijeti izradi strategije životne sredine i akcionog plana BH ESAP 2030+, putem e-konsultacija. Više informacija o tome možete naći na našem sajtu www.esap.ba. Prvi ciklus e-konsultacija je planiran sad za ovaj period. Ono što je potrebno jeste da odete na website, registrujete se i putem e-maila ćete redovno dobijati newslettere i moći ćete da učestvujete u radu strategije životne, u razvoju strategije životne sredine i akcionog plana. Također nas možete zapratiti i na Facebook stranici ESAP, BH ESAP. Toliko od mene za ovaj uvod. Melina.
Hvala Borislave. Izvrstan uvod. Zapravo želim da vam kažem još da je ovaj webinar upravo i planiran kako bi se malo povećala znanja učesnika radnih grupa predstojići dakle sastanak radnih grupa koji će se održati krajem ovog mjeseca. I još jednu stvar želim da kažem prije nego što pređemo na sljedeću prezentaciju od Lize Johansson, jeste da vi možete odabrati opciju jezika, jezičnu opciju. Vi ste dobili te sve upute u okviru e-maila, u okviru pozivnice. Međutim, evo još jednom da napomenem da koristite ovu dole na dnu ekrana ikonu u obliku globusa, gdje možete kliknuti i odabrati BH jezik i dakle, imati ove prezentacije na lokalnom jeziku, dakle na našem jeziku. Ja bih sada najavila Lizu Johansson iz Agencije za okoliš, odnosno životnu sredinu iz Švedske. Evo sada možete vidjeti ovdje njenu kratku biografiju. Ranije je radila kao konsultant za akustiku, a ima iskustvo u mjerenju nivoa buke, mapiranju buke i programima za ublažavanje buke od drumskog, željezničkog i aviosaobraćaja i industriji. Pa evo pozivam Lizu da nam se obrati sa svojom prezentacijom. Liza.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Good. In this presentation, I will start with summarizing how noise is regulated in the EU. This will be a rather short summary, and later today I will go into more detail specifically concerning the Environmental Noise Directive, which is one of the major parts of the EU noise acquis. You can change slide there, please. I think if you go back one slide. Yes, thank you. Yes, my name is Lisa Johansson, and I work at the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency as a scientific officer. I work with mainly two areas, which is noise in general, and also with guidelines and environmental permit processes for airports and harbors. My background is that I am an acoustician. I have a licentiate degree in acoustics, and I worked for about 15 years as a consultant with mostly environmental noise projects. As such, I had a small part in the first round of noise mapping according to the END of Stockholm, which turned out to be a very difficult project. We hadn't done that kind of project before, and we underestimated the time and effort it took to finalize that project. So it took much longer than expected and actually became a substantial financial loss for the company I worked with. But on the upside, we also learned a lot, and I have later worked with other cities that are about to do noise mapping, and also with action plans and other noise abatement programs. You can change slide there, please. Noise regulations in the EU is divided in two parts. First, there is a collection of regulations concerning the noise sources, like road vehicles and aircrafts. And then there is the Environmental Noise Directive, or the END, which states that all large cities, roads, railroads, and airports should report how many people are exposed to noise to the EU every 5 years. And they should also produce an action plan every 5 years to show how they plan to reduce the numbers of exposed to noise. And as I said, I will go into more detail about the END later today. As for the regulations, they are, as I said, specifying noise emission regulations for road vehicles, aircrafts, railroad, and other outdoor equipments. And you can change slide, please. For the regulations on road vehicles, there are a few to consider. These states limit values for the noise emission for different kind of vehicles, both trucks, motorcycles, normal cars, etc. And there is also specific regulations concerning tire noise, since one of the major sound sources for traffic noise is the connection between the road surface and the tire. And you might have seen the classification in the image to the right for tires, where it is specified how the tire performs in terms of fuel consumption, grip on wet surfaces, and also noise. And these kinds of classifications are meant to make it easier for the consumers to do an informed choice when buying new tires. Next slide. For railroads, there are also several regulations that in different ways concern noise. I will not go into every detail of these, but one of the bigger questions that have been discussed in the EU these latest few years is a ban on railway brakes of caster iron on freight trains. Changing the brakes to composite materials would significantly reduce the noise emitted from the trains. But it has also been shown that composite brakes, the quieter ones that they want to change to, are not as safe as caster iron brakes in very cold temperatures. And since railway cars are meant to travel all across Europe, and they are very much international and travel across the country borders, they must work both in the warmth of southern Spain, for example, and in the cold northern Finland. And this is a typical example where you have to weigh the environmental factors against what could possibly be an obstacle for the free trade in the EU. Next slide. For aircraft noise, there is also limits concerning noise emission. Older aircrafts with high noise emission, so-called Chapter 3 aircrafts, are banned from many European airports. And the regulation of aircrafts is in many ways international, with the international organ ICAO responsible for most of the policies concerning traffic, safety, and environment from aircraft. There is also the European organ EASA working with similar questions. The member states in EASA is the EU and a few others like Norway. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is one of the pan-European partners to EASA and is as such cooperating with EASA in some of the agreements, but they are not, as of today, a full member. And you can change slide. And finally, there is a European directive concerning noise emissions from equipment used outdoors. And this directive is targeting a broad range of equipment. And as you can see from the examples in the pictures, it is everything from large machines and vehicles used for groundworks and contracting, down to small privately owned lawn movers. And this directive includes both limit values for noise emission for certain equipment, and also standardized methods for noise measurements that can be used for many kinds of equipment. So it's a very broadly targeting directive. And next slide. And apart from the noise emission, there is also the Environmental Noise Directive that targets the exposure rather than the emission from noise sources. And in short, the END says that large cities, railroads, airports, and roads should calculate noise maps and the number of inhabitants exposed to noise every 5 years and report this to the EU. And they should use standardized methods to do these calculations. And then they should also make an action plan every 5 years on how to reduce noise and how to reduce the numbers of exposed. And that action plan should also be reported to the EU every 5 years. And as I said, I will later today go into detail on how to work with the END and what steps needs to be taken to fulfill the requirements of the END. So I will not go into more detail about that now. So this part was the short summary of the EU regulations in general. And then after we have heard Charlotta, I will return to talk more about the END. Thank you.
Hvala Liza. Sada nam slijedi prezentacija od Charlotte Eriksson, Karolinska institut. Možda evo da vidimo i njenu biografiju. Dakle, doktorica Charlotte Eriksson je ekološki epidemiolog u Centru za radnu i ekološku medicinu u Štokholmu i istraživač na Institutu za ekološku medicinu, Karolinska institut. Najvažnija istraživanja koja provodi tiču se uticaja upravo izloženosti buci iz okruženja na zdravlje s naglaskom na kardiovaskularna i oboljenja metabolizma. Veoma često dakle učestvuje u procjenama zdravstvenog rizika s obzirom na buku iz okoline na regionalnom, nacionalnom i međunarodnom nivou. Charlotte, izvolite.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Charlotte Eriksson, and I would like to thank you for this opportunity to present on the impact of noise on human health. Next slide, please. So as we've heard, the definition of community noise according to the END, the Environmental Noise Directive, is that it is unwanted or harmful outdoor sound created by human activity. For instance, noise emitted at different means of transport, road, railway, aircraft traffic, and also industrial noise or activities. But there are, of course, many other sources around us. For instance, construction work, noise from neighbors, restaurants, bars, waste management, and more. So the picture is rather complex when it comes to noise exposure in general. Next slide, please. Community noise is also an increasing problem, and it is actually one of our most common environmental problems. And it's also a problem that continues to increase. In Sweden, we now have 85% of the population living in urbanized areas. We also have an increase of traffic or transports, and the densification and building of new homes in really noise polluted areas. Next, please. It has been estimated that approximately 20% of the European population live in areas where the traffic noise levels can be harmful to human health, around 55 dB. And the major source is road traffic, followed by railway noise, aircraft noise, and also industrial noise. But this is likely to be an underestimation, since the European Environmental Noise Directive does not cover all areas of the EU. Next, please. So in 2018, the WHO came out with new environmental noise guidelines with the aim to provide recommendations for protecting human health from exposure to environmental noise originating from various sources. And this regulation was based on several systematic reviews and meta-analysis on critical health effects of noise. And you can see the link to the document here in my slide. Next, please. So there are many different health effects from following noise exposure. At very high noise levels, it may cause difficulties for the hearing organ and cause hearing loss and even tinnitus. But this is mostly common in occupational settings. So when it comes to more moderate noise levels from community noise, we have a number of other responses. For instance, a general annoyance response, difficulties in communication and speech perception, loss of concentration, and also effects on cognitive functioning. Noise-exposed populations also often experience sleep disturbances and may be found in a state of chronic stress, which in turn may enhance the risk for several cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, for instance, hypertension, myocardial infarction, stroke, and obesity. So I would like to go through the evidence on some of these health outcomes here for you now. Next, please. Noise annoyance is the most common effect in noise-exposed populations. It is a subjective experience of discomfort and irritation arising from unavoidable sounds. And usually it's measured by self-report, the percentage of highly annoyed in a population, denoted %HA, highly annoyed. And the degree of annoyance depends on a large number of factors. It is closely related, of course, to the characteristics of the sound, the volume, the frequency, the duration, and the temporality, to mention some. Next, please. The annoyance response also depends on the situation you're in, what time of day it is, and what type of activity you're engaging yourself in, like sleeping, resting, or reading, or some more activity. It also depends on who you are, your personal factors, age, and mental and physical health, your attitudes towards the noise source, and also coping mechanisms. That is, your possibilities to avoid the noise. Next, please. So on a population level, we can see clear exposure response patterns between noise levels and the proportion of highly annoyed in the population. So WHO has defined 10% highly annoyed as a so-called critical effect. And this is reached at about 53 dB LDEN for road traffic, 54 for railway traffic, and already at 45 dB LDEN for aircraft traffic. Next, please. So it seems that aircraft noise at any given level is the most disturbing of these traffic noise sources. This figure shows an example from Stockholm data, where you can clearly see that the annoyance response is much higher for aircraft than for road traffic and railway noise. But of course, the annoyance response in a population is also regulated or moderated by several factors. For example, we saw effects of building type, of the construction year of the building, if you have an access to quiet side or not, and whether or not the building was soundproofed. Next, please. This is again an example from our Stockholm population, where we saw an increased risk for reduced communication and speech perception as a function of the road traffic noise. So here we can see an increased reporting of communication problems relating to the outdoor noise level at your home. And this was significant associations for both road, railway, and aircraft noise. So a clear exposure response association for all traffic noise sources with communication difficulties. Next, please. Noise may also interfere with our cognitive functions, with performance, and also with learning. And this is especially true when we have complex tasks with high demands on speech perception, concentration, and also memory. And potential mechanisms for this is that sound may mask information and lead to lower speech perception. But noise may also distract our attention, increase stress levels, and lead to tiredness and exhaustion. Next, please. Yes. So children are seen as a particular vulnerable group when it comes to cognitive effects of noise. And children are still evolving both mentally and physically, and their cognitive processes are not completely developed. So they're therefore more easily distracted by sounds in their environment. And studies on traffic noise and cognitive functioning in children show, for example, effects on reading comprehension, deteriorated standardized tests, worsened memory functioning, and also effects on children's motivation to finish tasks. So a sort of learned helplessness. The so-called branch study is the today largest study available on cognitive effects of children of noise. So it involved approximately 2,000 children in the ages 9 to 10 years, going to schools around 3 major European airports. It was Schiphol in Amsterdam, Barajas in Madrid, and also Heathrow, London. And in this particular study, they found associations between aircraft noise and impaired reading comprehension, episodic memory, working memory, and also sustained attention. But there were no associations with road traffic here. Next, please. Turning to sleep disturbances, sleep is a necessity for both physical and mental health. It is an important outcome per se, but it's also important as a mediator to more serious illness. For example, sleep problems have been associated with cardiovascular diseases, obesity, and also depression. Sleep can be measured both objectively through, for example, polysomnography, EEG activity, and muscle tonus, or subjectively through self-report of high sleep disturbance. This figure shows the normal sleep structure, a stable sleep structure over the night of approximately 8 hours. It shows different sleep stages from quite deep sleep in the beginning of the night to more lighter sleep, REM sleep, or dream sleep in the end of the night. And especially the deep sleep, the short wave sleep, is important for restoration and memory consolidation. Next, please. So this is what happens when we have a night with disturbed sleep, noise-disturbed sleep. So we have a reduced total sleep time due to, for example, insomnia, awakenings during the night, and also early awakenings in the morning. So what happens is that we have a fragmented sleep pattern with shorter periods of coherent shortwave sleep and REM sleep. We also have cardiovascular arousals, for example, increases in blood pressure and heart rate, and an increased level of stress hormones, for example, cortisol. And this is possible since the auditory system is always open for impressions, even when we sleep. Next, please. Yes. So this shows you that there is an association between the noise levels within the bedroom and the probability of sleep stage changes or awakenings due to road traffic, aircraft, and railway noise. So you can see that the more noise we have in our bedroom, the greater is the risk of going into lighter sleep stages or even to a state of awake. Next. There are also on a population level clear exposure associations between noise levels outdoor in the residential areas and the percentage in the population reporting being highly sleep disturbed. And again, we can see here that aircraft noise seems to be more disturbing than road traffic and railway noise at any particular noise level. When it comes to the cardiovascular and metabolic effects of community noise, there are several potential biological mechanisms present here. So in the acute phase, noise may actually cause a stress response through the activation of our sympathetic nervous system and also the endocrine system. So what happens is that we have hemodynamic and metabolic and immunological effects of this noise exposure. For example, we have an increase in stroke volume and heart rate, vasoconstriction, which increases blood pressure, and also release of free fatty acids and mobilization of glucose, to mention a few. And in the long run, noise exposure may lead both to annoyance and sleep disturbances, as we talked about, but also may cause a dysregulation of the stress mechanism. And this would lead to an increased risk of several cardiovascular diseases, for instance, then hypertension, myocardial infarction, and stroke. And also during recent years, it's been speculating that noise may actually also cause metabolic outcomes in terms of increased risk of obesity, glucose regulation, and type 2 diabetes. Next, please. So this is just to show you where we are at with regards to state of research at the moment. And this is based on the WHO literature reviews and meta-analysis. So for the evidence on hypertension, high blood pressure, these studies have mainly focused on road traffic noise. So there are, at the time, at 2015, 26 cross-sectional studies showing an increased risk of about 5% per 10 decibel increase in noise level. But there were only one present cohort study, which is longitudinal. So this is a limitation, and the WHO actually graded the evidence as low quality due to the fact that we had studies of rather low quality, the cross-sectional rather than the longitudinal design. Next, please. However, with regards to ischemic heart disease, such as myocardial infarction, the evidence is rated as high quality. And this is because there are several longitudinal studies which have followed up people up in time for a quite long time and see that noise is actually associated with an increased risk of incident ischemic heart disease. And this evidence is as strongest for road traffic noise, with a relative risk of 1.08, which means that we have an 8% increase in risk per 10 dB noise level. And it is statistically significant. Next slide. And this shows the exposure response association. And as you can see, the risk of ischemic heart disease seemed to increase with increasing noise level, starting from approximately 50, somewhere 55 dB L10. Next. The evidence on outcomes such as stroke, obesity, and diabetes is more scarce. We have fewer studies, and they are mainly of cross-sectional design, which limits then our possibilities to infer causality. But we do have some studies indicating associations. And as we've talked about, we have also clear biological mechanisms underlying these associations, which warrants then continuous research. But overall, the WHO graded the evidence as low quality, mainly because of a lack of studies. Next. So just to finish off, a few words about the noise abatement strategies, which we will hear more also from Lisa in a short while. In Sweden, we follow the European Environmental Noise Directive, since we are a member state of the EU. And this is the main instrument to identify noise pollution levels and to trigger necessary actions. And these are recurrent processes recurring in cycles of 5 years, with noise mappings and also noise action planning. And we're now also turning to development of common noise exposure assessment methods to be able to compare data more across Europe. Next. So these are just some examples on how you can tackle noise issues and how you can actually reduce noise exposure in populations and prevent the noise exposure effects on health in the population. So to start with, to adhere to the WHO noise guidelines and also to the national guidelines is of crucial importance. You must also take noise into account early on in the planning process to prevent the harmful effects. For example, you have to be careful with placement of new residential areas, schools, roads, railways and airports, etc. You should also turn to building construction and promote the building or construction of quiet courtyards. Make sure the insulation of buildings is adequate, and also take into account the bedroom positioning in the buildings during the night so that people can sleep well. You can also tend to the traffic situation as such. For example, traffic can be routed outside the city center, at least the heavy traffic. Or even if you have the possibility, you can lead the traffic below ground in tunnels. You can work on speed limits, lower speed, it reduces noise. Implementation of electric cars can lead to, at least at low speeds, reduce the noise. You can work with low noise tires. As mentioned, there are regulations in the EU for this. You can have quiet asphalt. We have worked a lot of this with this in Sweden to try to produce asphalt which is low noise emissions. You can also work with the local noise screens and other technical solutions in existing buildings, such as changing windows or ventilations to more sound reduction variants. And finally, you as an individual can also have different coping mechanisms to cope with the noise. For example, use of earplugs or keeping your windows closed. So this is just a battery of examples of how you can work with reducing harmful effects of noise in your population. And with that, I would like to thank you and show this, I think, beautiful green noise screen, which not only reduces noise, but also promotes biological diversity. So many thanks.
Hvala zaista na izvrsnoj prezentaciji. Meni je bila veoma zanimljiva. Zapravo pitanja zaštite okoliša najviše i postanu ozbiljna kada se saznaju koji su to sve uticaji na ljudsko zdravlje. Meni je, evo da kažem, veoma interesantno bilo čuti ove uticaje na djecu u razvoju. Vjerujem da i ostalim učesnicima, nisam znala za te informacije. Hvala vam na ovako iscrpnoj i vrlo zanimljivoj prezentaciji koja je zasnovana zapravo na studijama, vrlo opsežnim studijama koji su za koji je kvalitet podataka i potvrđen od Svjetske zdravstvene organizacije. Evo, mi smo završili i malo ranije sa ovom prezentacijom, koju minutu, da tako kažem. Sada po našoj agendi slijedi i jedna kraća pauza, pa evo, imat ćemo pauzu od nekih 15 minuta, dakle počinjemo ponovo u 10 sati. Nastavit ćemo tada sa prezentacijom gospodina Viktora Minkevića iz Rumunije, ali o tome poslije pauze. Nastavljamo sa webinarom. Nadam se da su u međuvremenu oni učesnici koji su imali neke tehničke probleme uspjeli da ih i otklone. Evo ja ću reći da nas trenutno prati 95 učesnika i veoma smo zadovoljni dakle, zbog toga. Tokom današnjeg dana dakle, uspjeli ste čuti nešto o pravnim tekovinama Evropske unije koji nalažu određene zahtjeve po pitanju buke u okolišu. Zatim uspjeli ste čuti nešto i o direktnim uticajima na ljudsko zdravlje od buke. A sada ćemo čuti nešto i o implementaciji evropske regulative u vezi sa bukom iz okoline od strane gospodina Viktora Minkevića iz Rumunije, iz Generalne direkcije za procjenu, evo imamo ovdje sada i biografiju. Dakle, gospodin Minkević je savjetnik u Ministarstvu životne sredine i okoliša Rumunije, gdje radi već 16 godina na pitanjima procjene i upravljanja bukom. Njegove aktivnosti uključuju izradu nacrta i zagovaranje zakona u oblasti buke u cilju transpozicije i praćenja implementacije direktive o buci u Rumuniji. Učešće u radnim grupama u oblasti buke koje organizuje Evropska komisija i Evropska agencija za okoliš, učešće u TAEX misijama na temu buke za zajednicu Turaka na Kipru. Evo, to su neka iskustva, a sada ćemo čuti i prezentaciju gospodina Viktora. Izvolite, Viktore.
Hello, everybody. You hear me? Okay, thank you.
Čujemo, izvolite.
Okay, thank you. My name is Viktor Minkević. I work in Ministry of Environment, Water and Forest from Romania. And my field of activity is noise. I am glad to be here with you. And because yesterday was the International Day for Women, I want to wish to women which are present at this meeting a beautiful spring and a lot of happiness. I would also like to express my gratitude to the organizers for the opportunity they offer me to be here with you. And today I will present the Romanian example in approaching the environmental noise. Regarding the situation of noise in Romania before EU accession, before we become a member of European Union, I can tell you that before 2007, which was the year when Romania became the member state, in Romania the noise was assessed only using measurements. At the level of our Polytechnic University of Bucharest, together with Bucharest City Hall, in 17th was made some noise maps in Bucharest, but only using measurements. Generally, the noise measurements in this in these cities in the past was made by the City Hall together with the research institute from communist period. Regarding the legislation in that period, was available some legislation regarding hygiene and public health rules on the living environment of the population. And these rules provided also some rules for noise. There was also a national standard at that time, which provide limit values for noise in urban areas. This national standard exists also now, but in the updated version. In the 2004-2007 period was the period of pre-accession of EU of Romania. In that period, we ensured the first transposition of END in our legislation. Of course, because we was a member state, this transposition was not a full transposition. Slide 2, please. Thank you. After the transposition of END, which was made first time in 2005, in the first year of our presence in European Union in 2007, Romania needs to make strategic noise maps for 9 agglomerations, one major airport, around 250,000 kilometers of major routes, and around 67,000 kilometers of major railway. This task was very hard for us because it was the first year where Romania was a member state of the European Union, and we didn't were prepared for this in terms of technical preparation of noise mapping. In this governmental decision for 2005, which ensured the first transposition of END in our legislation, the responsible authorities were generally defined, but as well as agglomeration, main road, major airport, and major railways, but they were not identified by name, being provided in the legislation only the criteria for identifying them. For this reason, it was very hard for our authorities to fulfill this task in good condition in 2007. In order to improve this situation, in 2007, we make the first modification of our governmental decision, which ensured the transposition of END in our national legislation. In order to solve the infringement which Romania received for the European Commission for bad transposition, and also to solve some aspects regarding, to improve some aspects regarding the responsibility of authorities, and also to identify by name in our legislation all our agglomeration, major roads, major railways, and major airports. Also in 2008-2011 period, was developed guidelines for noise mapping, for action planning, and regulation for noise limit. But unfortunately, these guidelines not was available in, for the first round of noise mapping and action planning, but only for the second and for the third round of them. In 2012 and in 2017. In 2012 and in 2016, we have also 2 new governmental decisions which made some modification of our legislation regarding who have the responsibility to make noise map and action plans for some noise sources inside agglomeration. In 2018, Romania received the first infringement for bad implementation We didn't make the action plans in time, but we solved this infringement because the authorities who were late with action planning solved the problem and finalized the action plans. Also in 2009, we make a new legislation, a law, and to repeal all previous governmental decision and all our legislation in noise field. This law also ensured the transposition of new Gnosos directive, that Gnosos common method for noise mapping. Now we work to modify again the law in order this law in order to ensure the transposition of other new directive regarding those effect relations which replace the Annex 3 of Environmental Noise Directive. Also this year we need to put in law also some new guidelines regarding noise mapping and action planning. Next year, we need also to take in consideration to make to put in our legislation the requirements of the new reporting mechanism, which is developed now by the European Commission. This new directive is not finalized, but I think this year will be enforced. Next slide, please. In Romania and also in the European Union was 3 rounds of noise mapping and action planning until now. And in this slide, we see the evolution of a number of agglomeration, major roads, major railways, and major airports in Romania for the last 3 noise mapping rounds. In the first round, we need to make noise maps only for agglomerations which have more of 250,000 inhabitants and major roads which have more of 6 million vehicles per year and major railways which had more of 60,000 vehicles per year. But in round 2 and 3, we made noise maps for all agglomeration, all major roads and major railways. Now we prepare for the other new noise for the next new round noise mapping and action planning, which will have deadline in 2022 for noise mapping and 2024 for action planning. If you see in these slides, in 2007 we have only 9 agglomerations, for example, and in 2017 we have 20. This difference is because in the first round we made the noise map only for agglomeration which have more of 250,000 inhabitants. And now we made the noise maps for all agglomeration. Next slide, please. In this slide, I present the evolution of authorities which have the responsibility for noise mapping and action planning in last 3 noise mapping rounds. As you can see, in some cases, the responsibility are different in round 2 from round round 1 from round 2 or round 3. That because in the first round, the noise maps and action plans was made for city halls for all noise sources from agglomeration. This approach was changed in round 2 when we put the responsibility for noise mapping and action planning to airport administration for air traffic, which are inside agglomeration. And also the approach was changed in round 3 when we put the responsibility for noise mapping and action planning to our national railway company for railway traffic inside agglomeration. Next round, we don't have the intention to change something. That means in the next noise mapping round, the authorities which will have the responsibility to make noise map and action plans will be the same like in round 3. This approach was to improve our implementation of environmental noise directive. Was because in the first round we was prepared to make noise map and action plans, and authorities which make in first round this job don't have in administration of these noise sources. For this reason, was very hard for them to make some action plans for something which are not in them administration. For example, inside Bucharest agglomeration, we have one airport, and we have also railway traffic, but all railways are under our national railway company administration, and the airport administration are not under City Hall administration and is under Ministry of Transport administration. For this reason, in 2007, when we was the first round of noise mapping and action planning, City Hall made a lot of activities for noise mapping and action plans for some sources which are not in them administration, and we improve this approach for 2000 in the second round and in the third round of noise mapping. Okay, next slide, please. In this slide, I present the evolution of who made the noise map and action plans in Romania last 3 rounds. If our legislation responsibilities to different authorities to make this job, but they can make this job using consultants or using some internal specialized compartment, like noise office, for example. Only our national road company make noise map and action planning using noise office, and all other authorities make the noise maps using external consultants. Next slide, please. Also, in Romania, we had in the past some implementation problems. This type of problems, more or less, are common also in other countries from the European Union. The most important problem are lack of expertise of noise city halls, delay to the procurement procedure, fluctuation of the staff in the city hall between noise mapping rounds. For example, in 2020, in some city hall, we have some persons which was in charge for noise field activity, and after 5 years, this person go in the private to work, and we have other person in charge which don't have enough expertise to do for this job. These type of problems in general are common for city halls. We have a good organization inside our national road company, national railway company, or or inside our airport administration, which make noise maps. But with city halls, it's other type of problems, because this fluctuation of staff and this delay of budget of the procurement procedures are the main problems in our delays of the noise maps and action plans. These main problems generally lead to delay in the development of strategic noise map and action plan, or in the delivery of lower quality of noise map, because the city halls do not have the necessary details to make a request to the consultant on the quality of these noise maps. This type of problem can be solved only by develop a good cooperation with local authorities to provide them guidelines and information, by making them aware of the importance of reducing noise in agglomeration and localities, in the other localities in general. Next slide, please. In future, in Romania, we need to develop new guidelines regarding noise mapping and action planning. Also, our authority, which are in charge with noise mapping, need to make the noise maps using non-sociu method now, a hard job, because for some cases, new input data are needed. For example, for road traffic noise mapping, more types of vehicles need to be taken into account. And our national road company, for this reason, need to develop a new database regarding the number of vehicles and types of vehicles which are needed for noise mapping. Also, the environmental authorities need to have some tools in order to check if consultants, for example, which make noise maps, use the non-sociu methods and no other methods, because like I say in the previous slides, the staff of the city hall not have a good expertise in noise field, and they need to know very exactly how they can check if a consultant make a good quality job. And for that, we need to provide some guidelines in order to help them to fulfill this job. Also, in action planning for next round, we need to have a correlation of noise reduction measurements with the data provided by those effect relations from the new Annex 3 of Environmental Noise Directive. This type of correlation was in the previous action plans. This will be a new job for them, and our estimation is also the city hall will have problem to put in application this Annex 3. We need very clear to show them how they need to fulfill this content of the Annex 3. Also, next noise mapping round, we need to put in accordance the noise maps and the quiet areas with Inspire Directive requirements. The Inspire Directive is a new other European directive which put member states to make available all the environmental data to the public using tools provided by the European Union geoportal. In order to make our noise maps and our quiet areas in a format which are complying with Inspire Directive, we need also to guide our local authorities, especially in order for them to know very clear which information and which type of data they need to provide in order to fulfill also the Inspire Directive. Also, now we take in consideration in Romania to define some quiet areas in open country. Until now, we have in our legislation an approach regarding the quiet areas in site agglomeration, but regarding the quiet areas in open country, we didn't have until now some approach, and we want in the future modification of our law to have some approach in order to establish some quiet area in open country. All that are new jobs for our authorities, and for this reason, the next round of noise maps and action plans we estimate will be more difficult to put in application. Next slide, please. In conclusion, implementation of the Environmental Noise Directive represents a lot of things which our authorities need to make: noise maps using no-CSU method, action plans using dose effect relations, provide noise maps and quiet areas in inspired format, develop tools in order to make accessible of them by the population using European Union geoportal. All these things are new. We didn't make this job in the past in the first 3 noise mapping rounds. And for this reason, a continuous preparation of the authorities for the noise mapping and action planning is needed, and a continuous harmonization of the legislation, taking into consideration the gaps which we detect during the implementation of Environmental Noise Directive, need to take in consideration in our legislation. Also, in order to prevent the future infringements from the European Union, continuous follow-up of the delays in making noise maps and action plans and speeding up the actions of completion of them is needed. We have we have in 2018 infringement for delays of make our action plans, and we saw how hard it is to solve this problem in order to close this type of infringements. For all this reason, our recommendation is that the environmental authorities in your country, which will develop the necessary legislation for noise mapping and action planning, and the authorities responsible to make noise mapping and action planning need to collaborate with each other to solve easier the problems that generally occur in the implementation of Environmental Noise Directive. Especially without collaboration between environmental authorities and the city halls, will be very hard to put in application, to have a good application of Environmental Noise Directive. Next slide. Thank you for your attention.
Hvala i vama na zaista izvrsnoj prezentaciji. Meni je bila također veoma interesantna, naročito uzevši u obzir da evo, i Bosna i Hercegovina se priprema za pristupanje Evropskoj uniji i veoma interesantno čuti da evo iskustva iz Rumunije koja su od 2007. godine pa do danas u nekoliko navrata usavršavali proces mapiranja i izrade akcionih planova. Što je, evo da kažem, na neki način veoma zgodan primjer za učesnike radnih grupa kada budemo izrađivali određene mjere, da imamo osjećaja koliko s čime da krenemo, uzevši u obzir da ni naši institucionalni kapaciteti nisu na zadovoljavajućem nivou kada je u pitanje upravljanje bukom, mogu reći na području cijele Bosne i Hercegovine, a evo, usuđujem se reći i javnost nije, kako da kažem, dovoljno osviješćena o uticaju buke. Sada smo, dakle, završili smo sa svim prezentacijama koje smo imali u planu danas i sada nam slijedi panel diskusija kada ću ja pročitati
Melina,
koja imam.
mislim da imamo još drugi dio gospođe Johansen.
Evo ja nisam to pribilježila ovdje. Oprostite, hvala Borislave. Onda imamo i drugi dio prezentacije Lize. Liza, izvolite.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I will continue this presentation with going more into detail about the Environmental Noise Directive and what it contains and what kind of work that needs to be done to fulfill what is in the directive. And you can change slide, please. This is the same slide as I ended my first presentation with. It's a summary of the END and what it contains. That is that you need to do calculations of environmental noise and how many that are exposed to environmental noise, and action plans on how to reduce the noise. And you can also see the limits for when the END applies. And as you can see, it's not just the really big cities that are involved, but rather medium-sized cities and above, with more than 100,000 inhabitants. And then there are also the major roads and major railways and airports that are a part of the END. In 2017, the END covered 511 urban areas across the EU territory, 420,000 kilometers of major road, 50,000 kilometers of major railways, and 89 major airports. So it's quite a large task that is being done in the EU every 5 years of mapping these cities and infrastructure. You can change the slide. Before we go into more detail about the END, I want to mention the noise indicators that we are using. They have been mentioned before today, and I thought we could just define what they mean. The noise mapping should report the LDEM level, which is the day, evening, and night level, and also the night level, L-night. The LDEM is a year averaged equivalent noise level, where the noise level at night has a penalty of 10 dB. And this is because people tend to be more sensitive to noise disturbances at night. And the noise level on evenings also have a penalty, but of only 5 dB. And the time intervals for the evening period and the night period can vary between countries, but it's often the ones that I show on these slides. In some countries, they have postponed the evening and the night 1 hour, but they should always be 4 hours of evening and 8 hours of night. But the night can start at 11 o'clock instead of 10 o'clock. And then there is the night level, which is the equivalent level without any penalties for 8 hours of night, often from 10 p.m. L-night is often used also to estimate the risk of sleep disturbances. There are other noise indicators used throughout Europe, like the 24-hour equivalent level without any penalties. And in some cases also the Lmax is used, which is the maximum noise level during a certain specific period of time. The Lmax is most commonly used for industrial noise, but also in some cases for estimating sleep disturbances with indoor noise. There are also different ways to calculate or estimate the negative health effects, such as annoyance, sleep disturbance, and increased risk of heart disease. One way to do that is to calculate the cost for society for different kinds of negative health effects. That cost can then be used for a cost-benefit analysis for different noise reduction measures. And in the next round of noise mapping, according to the END, the member states should also report a cost of the negative health effects for the first time. One other indicator that can be used is DALYs. And DALY is an abbreviation for disability adjusted life years. And that includes both the life years lost due to premature deaths due to disease, and also life years affected by disease, such as high blood pressure, or disability, such as hearing loss. And the Swedish Transport Administration did an estimation of DALYs due to noise a few years ago in Sweden and calculated it to be about 40,000 DALYs per year. And that includes about 500 premature deaths per year. And that can be correlated to the population in Sweden, which is about 10 million people. Within the EU, it is estimated that noise leads to about 450,000 DALYs per year due to high annoyance alone, and the same amount for sleep disturbance, and then about 150,000 DALYs per year due to ischemic heart disease. So adding these numbers up for the whole EU region, it tends to be quite high figures, showing that noise is in fact a major significant source for negative health. You can change slide. The Environmental Noise Directive can be seen as part of a noise reduction toolbox. We have regulations for noise sources on the EU level, and those can also be complemented with national policy. Then there are instruments that can be used in planning and abating noise in exposed areas. It can be noise regulations in national planning policies and also regulations in environmental permits for activities or industries that emit noise. And finally, to know where to make measures and to evaluate if measures have had an effect, there is the noise mapping and the following action plans. And if you work with these tools, the result should be a reduction in the number of people exposed to noise, and as such, following a reduction of the negative health effects, which leads to lower costs for society, but also, of course, a possibility of higher quality of life for those affected. Change slide, please. As I've said, the END consists of one part that is the noise mapping and one part that is the action plans. And you can boil that down to finding the answer to questions. How big is the problem and what should we do about it? The noise maps seem to often get attention in media. The cities like to go out and present the noise maps when they are finished, and some cities are also making them available on the city website. The action plan usually doesn't get the same attention, but in fact, it's the action plan that in many ways can be considered to be more important, because there is where you decide what to do to actually reduce the noise. The future noise exposure is very much depending on the ambition level of the action plan. And which I will talk about a bit later, the END doesn't really say anything about what you should do to reduce environmental noise or what actions that should be taken, only that you should have an action plan. And then it is up to the parties responsible to fill the action plan with effective measures. Next slide. And here is a flow chart that shows the different parts of the END taken from a report by the European Environmental Agency about noise in Europe. It's a very good report to read if you are interested in these questions. And I think Charlotte also showed the same picture earlier today. Here you can see the flow chart and what that should be done according to the END. In the first years, which sources that should be mapped, the major roads, the major railways, airports, and the agglomerations. And what steps that needs to be taken. You need to collect the data, you need to do a noise modeling and validation of that model, and you need to determine the population and building exposure. After that, you should report the results from the noise mapping as noise contours and also tables of how many people that are exposed in different sound level intervals. And after that is the next step of developing the action plan, where you need to identify where do we have the hotspots, where do we have the most exposed, do we have areas of other kinds that needs to be treated in some kind. We have schools and preschool yards, you have recreational areas, etc. And this process will repeat itself. So when you're finished with the noise mapping, you will do the action plan. And when the action plan is done, you can start working with the next round of noise mapping. And you might also, you can change slide here, please. The first step that should be taken even before beginning working with the END is to decide which parties on what levels that should be responsible for different activities. And here you need to look at how the nation with its entities, regions, and cities are organized. How is the responsibility best distributed among the stakeholders? You might also want to consider if the result of the noise mapping can have other uses. If you're doing these large-scale calculations, can you, for example, use them in planning purposes as well? Synergies with other uses will make the work more efficient. And you also need to think if you are already doing parts that is required for the END. For example, if you have a program for noise abatement around the major roads already. Next slide. The things you need to consider when organizing the work in the END is who holds the data necessary for doing noise mapping, like the information on traffic intensity on the roads, and who holds maps and GIS data with buildings and terrain. And these are parties that you need to involve early in the process to do the noise mapping. And then there is the question on who has use of the result. Noise mapping is a large project, and as I said, it can be gained by using the results for more than just reporting to the EU. Noise mapping over a city can be used for planning, for example. For the action plan, it is also of utmost importance to think through which stakeholders have the legal and factual right to do a certain measure. Some measures can be done by national or city administrations, but for others, you need to cooperate with private companies or private homeowners. And finally, you should also consider how to share the knowledge among the parties working with the END in one way or another. Especially since this is a project that returns every 5 years, it is important to gather experience and to improve the work going on to the next phase, making it easier and getting results with higher quality. For this, you will probably want to have some kind of cooperation between national and the local administrations, and also with acousticians and other experts in, for example, environmental medicine. Next slide. As an example, I have tried to summarize how the responsibilities for the END is distributed in Sweden. On the national level, we have the Environmental Protection Agency, where I work, and we have the responsibility to collect the results from noise mapping and the action plans and then reporting them to the EU. And we also share a national network where the parties involved in the END meet and share knowledge and information on a regular basis. And we are also taking part in the EU working groups concerning the END. Then also on the national level, we have the National Transport Administration, and they own and manage national roads and railroads and are responsible for noise mapping and action plans for those. And together with the National Airport Company, they also produce noise maps and action plans for the major airports. On the regional level, we have one public transport company with railway lines that exceeds 30,000 trains per year. So they are also included in the E&D work. And then there are the municipalities with more than 100,000 inhabitants. And that is what we count as an agglomeration in the E&D Directive. A city, as it is perceived, can consist of several municipalities, and this leads to that the noise map can be a bit, well, at least perceived as incomplete. If we look at the capital area of Stockholm, it consists of more than 10 different municipalities, and only 2 of them had more than 100,000 inhabitants and had in the latest round of noise mapping. So there are gaps in the noise maps if you look at the Stockholm area. And here you might argue that it could have been a better representation if we had a different definition of agglomeration. But on the other hand, it comes back to who has the factual and legal rights to do noise measures, and that lies very heavily on the municipalities. And getting several municipalities to agree on how to prioritize and finance noise-reducing measures would probably not have been very effective. But that is a decision you have to make when you are organizing the work in the E&D. Next slide. When you have pinpointed who are the responsible parties, those parties need to start organizing the noise mapping itself. And to do this, you need to have an understanding of what is needed for large-scale noise calculations. The EU have decided on which calculation models to use. It is called Knossos, and they have modules for road, rail, industry, and aircraft noise. This image shows primarily the data needed for road noise calculations. And to begin with, you need the data on the sources, that is the roads themselves. You need the geographic data of the roads, where they go, their location and their height in some kind of digital format. You also need to know how many vehicles per day or per year that passes on the road and how they are distributed during the day, evening and night, so you can calculate the LDN value. You also need to know the distribution of different vehicle types, how many cars and trucks and buses that go on the road. And you need to know the speed of the road, which most often we use the speed limit. And finally, you can also need some knowledge of what type of road it is, what is the road surface and how many lanes there are. And in some cases, it could be good to have very detailed data about these, but in other cases, you can probably do assumptions and estimations. Then, since it takes time to do measurement of traffic flows, it is important to start the inventory of existing data early. So you need to know if you need to do new measurements of traffic flows before starting the noise mapping. And for the calculations, you also need geographical data on the environment. You need the terrain heights, you need information on ground types, buildings, and noise screens. That is the major parts of doing noise calculations. You might also want to add vegetation, but it's not necessary because the damping effect of vegetation is not as high as many might think. And finally, there is the weather. Sound propagation is greatly affected by weather. But in these types of calculation, we almost always use a pre-decided standard weather to simplify the calculation and to make it possible to reproduce them. And since the noise indicator LDN is a year average value, the temporal difference in noise level due to that weather is evened out. So you don't need specific local weather data for doing this calculation, but you can use a more broader scale weather data. And finally, for calculating the numbers of exposed, you need population data in some kind. And having gathered all this data, what you do then, or what a consultant will do, is to build a geographical model in a computer and start with the calculations. And the result will be contour lines, like in the image on the top right, where you can see the colored areas around the roads with traffic, and where each colored area corresponds to 5 decibel intervals. And you can also get the tables with numbers of exposed inhabitants in different sound level intervals, like the table in the lower right. Next slide. When you gather the data, you need to take time to ensure that the quality and the coverage is as good as you like, because that will greatly affect the results. If there are gaps in the geographical data, you need to have time to fill those gaps before the noise mapping starts. And as I said, some data you can use assumptions and estimations instead of specific data on the local site. But where there are other data that you really want to have quite a good quality without the end result being too badly affected. And the EU have published a good practice guide for noise mapping that covers quite a lot of how you should think about the quality of data and which assumptions that are possible to use to simplify this process. Noise screens is a very important data to include in the calculations, since they are often placed in the areas with the highest exposure. And not adding them will exaggerate the numbers of exposed, and adding them but overestimating their effect will underestimate the numbers of exposed. And it's our experience in Sweden that noise screens are not always included in the geographical maps that we use for noise calculations. And if they are often just included as a line, and there are no information on the height of the screen. So in many cases, the noise screens had to be visually inspected, which takes quite a lot of time. And for population data, in some parts you might have the population data linked to certain buildings, and that is of course a very good quality of data. But in other areas you might have the population in a larger area, and you want to use a distribution with number of people per square kilometers, or you might want to distribute it based on the building size. There are different ways to go here, depending on what the level of detail of the data that you have available. Next slide. For railroad, the sound sources differ a bit from road noise. The noise emission from different kinds of road vehicles are included in the calculation models. But for train models, that database of vehicles is not as extensive as it is for road vehicles. And you might have national train types that are missing in the databases. So before starting noise calculations, you need to do an inventory of the more common train types in your area and see if there are types that need to be measured before starting the noise mapping. And for trains, there are several sound sources at each train, which corresponds to the engine, the connection between the rail and the wheels, the brakes, and also aerodynamic noise from the rail body, the train body itself. And you need to measure each train at different speeds. So it takes quite a lot of work to decide the noise emission of a train. So this is something that you also need to start with early. For railroad noise calculations, you need to know the geographical data, of course, and the speed limits, just like for roads. But you also need to know about rail roughness, the maintenance of the rails, and also if there are bridges and switches, because they will greatly affect the noise emission. Otherwise, there is more or less the same data needed as for road noise calculations. Next slide. For airports, the data gathering is often a more simpler task than for road and railroad, because the traffic to major airports are usually well documented, and near the airports the aircraft follows certain tracks, making it fairly easy to distribute the annual traffic on the runways and the tracks for the specific airports. And then there are also international databases with noise emission data for common aircraft that can be used for noise mapping. So what you often do is that you group, if you have 10 aircrafts with a similar noise emission, you group them and you put the same noise emission on all of them. And then you use that as data for the calculations. So that is often a simpler and simpler project than doing road and rail calculations. Next slide. And finally, we have the noise from major industries, which should be included in the noise map for agglomerations. And in industries, it can also be ports and harbors. And industries are the most diverse of the major sound sources. It's easy to say that every industry has a unique noise emission. So it's not realistic to do detailed noise emission measurements for all industries within a city. So what you can do instead is to look at noise regulations in general, and also the environmental permits that the industries hold, and assume that all industries emit as much noise as they are allowed to do. It could be of interest to know if a certain industry has working hours or time restrictions that prohibits them from working at night, since the nighttime level is quite heavily affects the LDN. But otherwise, it's probably easiest to use some kind of estimations for the industrial noise, because, as I said, making measurements at each site is not a realistic task to do. Next slide. And this is just a short summary of what I've said about data gathering. It's important to put time and effort in doing this phase, because it will greatly affect the outcome of the noise mapping and the quality of noise mapping and what you can use the noise maps for in later stages. And probably you will start doing this the first round and you will learn a lot, and then you will start improving it to the next round, etc. Because this is definitely a work in progress. And you will learn as you are doing it what data you have and where you need to make put efforts to improve the data and etc. But it will take time. Next slide. When the data is available, the next phase is the actual calculations of noise. I will not say so much about that, because the calculations are most often made with commercial software. There are a couple of those available on the market, and the large softwares have been adapted for E&D noise mapping. They have certain modules that will simplify noise calculations for large areas. And it is my recommendation here that the noise calculations are done by consultants or other parties that have experience with working with noise calculations. You should know that the calculations require quite a lot of computer power. It's probably best to do them on a dedicated server or a network of computers. And if consultants are doing the calculations, it is important to think through the contract with the consultants. And that is a typical area where the cities doing noise mapping could benefit from discussing with each other and sharing experience on how to best form these contracts. Next slide. To summarize my advice for noise mapping, I want to stress again on the importance on that data gathering and the quality of control of data. Also to think if the noise map have other uses. And before starting the noise mapping a whole agglomeration or a large sections of roads for the first time, I also strongly recommend that you do test runs for smaller areas, just to see how the process are going and where the problems might arise. To improve the quality of the results, you might also want to do controlled measurements in certain places to validate the model. And while you're doing the noise mapping, also try to document the process as best as you can and try to learn as much as you can to simplify the next round. Next slide. Now I just want to talk a bit about the action plans, where the actual work is being done. As I said earlier, the E&D doesn't specify what actions you should take to reduce noise exposure, but it does say what an action plan should include. And it gives a framework for the process of developing an action plan. And that is the points on this slide and also the next slide, where it says that the action plan should have a description of the agglomeration or the road or what it is that it's describing, description of authorities, if you have limit values, a summary of the results of the noise mapping, etc. And it also should include a record of public consultation, but it's because that is a part of developing a noise action plan, is that the public should in some kind be consulted and be able to come with input to what the action plan should include. Next slide. This is just a continuing on what the END says about the framework for the action plan. There should be a description of the measures that are already being taken and the ones that you are planning. It should include financial information on budgets and cost effectiveness, cost benefit assessments, etc. And it should also contain estimations in terms of the reduction of number of people affected, so that you can follow up and see, did this action really get the result that we wanted? Next slide. You have rather free hands to form the actions you find suitable for your area. But the actions that could be considered are actions concerning traffic planning, like can we reduce the speed limit on a section of a road to reduce noise? Can we have some kind of regulations like forbidding nighttime traffic in a certain area, for example? Of course, the planning of new roads and planning of new residential areas is an important part. You can have technical measures at the sound sources, like changing road surfaces or noise abatement at industries. Selection of quieter sources, like buying buses that go on electricity instead of fuel, will reduce noise in city areas. You can have actions which is the reduction of sound transmission for noise screens, for example, and also vegetation in some kind. But as I said, vegetation doesn't really give as much result as you might want to, but there are often other benefits with vegetations, which you can add to noise reduction, so they can anyway be a good measure to do. And then you can have some kind of incentives for example, for homeowners to change windows or other kind of incentives to make other parties do measures to reduce noise. Next slide. I have an example from one of the cities in Sweden that is included in the END. It's a city of Umeå. It's a town in the northern Sweden, the pretty town, famous for its many birch trees. Umeå has about 130,000 inhabitants. It's a growing city. It has a university and a big hospital and an airport rather close to town. And there are major roads and railways near the city. And there are also industrial areas near to the city. And the noise mapping shows that about 40,000 of the inhabitants are exposed to road and rail noise over 55 dBA LDN. Next slide. This slide just shows you the noise map of Umeå, where you can clearly see the major roads going through the city. This is also a map that is available on the city website, so you can zoom in and look at your street and see what noise levels you are exposed to if you want to. And on the city website, you can also find the action plan, which you can see at the right, and that is an action plan that has been approved by the City Council, and it covers the period from 2019 to 2023. Next slide. The action plan of Umeå consists of actions targeting 11 different areas. Most actions are to reduce noise in and near dwellings, but there are also actions to reduce noise at schools and preschools, and to improve sound quality in parks and recreational areas. Some actions are focused on doing specific abatement measures, like building noise screens, while others are more strategical, like the one about increasing sustainable travel. Next slide. All actions are described in detail in a table, and this is one example from that table about reducing noise in schoolyards. And here you can see that in this table, you describe the action, what they want to do, what benefits that will be gained, what resources are needed, both in staff and money, what part of the city administration that is responsible, and a timetable for when the action should be finished. And this kind of presentation makes it very clear what the city aims to do, and it makes it also rather easy to evaluate how the action is progressing, if they will finish in time, and what it will cost. Next slide. This is another part of the action plan that I thought I would show you. It's about parks and recreation areas. And here the city have used the noise map to identify which parks that are exposed to noise. And they have put up a local guideline value as a criteria, saying that a park is noise exposed if it has more than 55 dBA at more than half of the area of the park. And so the red areas in this map are the parks that doesn't fulfill that guideline value. And that is the areas there that the city will prioritize measures to reduce noise. And you can also use this kind of presentation to highlight where the areas that already have a good soundscape, and then take measures to preserve those areas and make them more accessible to the public. That is another kind of action that you might want to do for recreations and parks. And next slide. The last action I want to lift as an example is programs with financial incentives for home and real estate owners to improve sound insulation of windows. In almost every home, the windows are the weak spot when it comes to sound insulation, and improving the windows will have a significant positive effect for noise level indoors, reducing the risk of negative health effects. Often you can improve the sound insulation of existing windows by adding extra glazing, so you don't need to change the whole window. Depending on the condition of the window, the extra glazing can reduce noise indoors with up to 10 dB. So you can get quite a lot of improvement with a fairly simple measure. And this action is done by the city deciding which homeowners should receive financial aid for improving sound insulation. Usually they target those with the highest noise exposure. The work of improving the windows is done by the homeowner himself or by a contractor that the homeowner hire, and then they get some kind of financial aid from the city. You should, of course, have some kind of control that the action has been done correctly by visual inspection or a measurement. But if it's done okay, the city will pay most of the cost for extra glazing, and exactly how much, if it's like 75% or 90%, you can decide for each city. And you should also be aware that improved sound insulation by extra glazing of this kind will also have positive effects on energy consumption. So it's a bonus for these kinds of action. And this is a typical action where it's outside the city's factual and legal right to do something at the buildings, but then they can use other incentives to make homeowners do something about the buildings. So finally, my last slide, I'm just going to mention something, thank you, about health costs. In the next round of noise mapping, according to the END, the member states should report not only how many are exposed to noise, but also the cost of the following health effects. And formulas for calculating health effects are based on the studies presented by the WHO guidelines for the European region, which came in 2018, which also Charlotta mentioned. The detail concerning these calculations has not been completely set, as far as I'm aware, and there are still some ongoing discussions. But it could be interesting to know that kind of calculations will be added to the END. And that is all I had to present, and thank you very much for listening. And so we move on to the next part of the workshop. Thank you.
Hvala Liza na veoma interesantnoj prezentaciji. Ja ću odmah prijeći na sljedeći dio naše agende, a tu je dakle panel diskusija gdje već imamo dosta pitanja i neka pitanja sam i ja pripremila zaista vjerujem da će nam svima pomoći u razumijevanju ove tematike i za bolje strateško planiranje kada je u pitanju buka. Pa evo, krenut ću sa pitanjem koje je zapravo prvo pristiglo u Q&A dio, a tiče se zapravo vjerskih objekata. Interesuje, dakle, učesnika interesuje da li postoje istraživanja, odnosno radovi na temu buke iz vjerskih objekata. Misli se dakle na crkve i džamije koje u određeno vrijeme dana bukom ili zvukom obavještavaju vjernike o molitvi. Dakle, buke također iz ugostiteljskih objekata u gradskim stambenim područjima. Dakle, pitanje se odnosi na vjerske objekte i ugostiteljske objekte u gradskim i stambenim područjima. Da li imate takva iskustva? Evo, možemo krenuti od Lizi.
I'm not aware of any studies about actual health effects from this kind of noise sources. I don't know if Charlotta might have more information on that. In what I do know, in Sweden we have some, it's not a general not general regulations, but in some cases there have been local regulations that either to reduce the noise level or just to have them at specific times. So it's okay to have church bells or mosques sounding during daytime, but not during nighttime, for example. I know there are church bells that have had to lower their noise from the bells during night, for example. So that kind of regulations, but not in general.
Evo, ne znam da li je da li Charlotte ili Viktor da li imaju nekih iskustava u ovom području. Ako ne, možemo prići na sljedeći pitanje. Tiče se i buke iz ugostiteljskih objekata. Imam nekoliko pitanja na tu temu, zapravo najviše iz razloga tog što u Bosni i Hercegovini se, evo da kažemo, pitanje buke najviše i doživljava nekako kao buka iz ugostiteljskih objekata. Evo imamo pitanje vezano za to da se takvi objekti obično otvaraju u prizemnim dijelovima stambenih zgrada, pa onda eto to stvara neku buku. Šta vi, kakve primjere imate u svojim državama, kako se to tretira? Možda pitanje za Lizu ili Viktora, možda više. Izvolite.
Yes, for like restaurants and bars and such, we have usually they are not allowed to serve alcohol too late at night. That is what they also most often use to make the bar close at a certain hour. And then we also have national guideline values for noise indoors. So if you have an activity, it doesn't really matter what kind of activity it is, but if that activity creates too loud noise indoors with closed windows, etc., then you need to do some kind of reducing measures, which is most often that they have to close at a certain time, most often at 10 o'clock p.m. That you can't have too loud activities after that hours in residential areas.
Regarding this question, in Romania, we have limit value 50 decibels outdoor and 45 decibels indoor. And this type of regulation are in a field of control of the city codes. We have also in Romania a problem with catering or restaurants which are in the buildings, residential buildings but we have this legislation, and city halls need to make this type of control when population have reclamations. I understood the question is also for some religious facilities, or only for restaurants and catering. Okay, regarding religion facilities, we don't have any regulation from noise.
U redu, evo ja bih prešla odmah na sljedeće pitanje. Zapravo imamo dva pitanja slične tematike. Kaže, prema akcionim planovima, ko je u obavezi da implementira mjere sanacije kada je u pitanju saobraćaj, industrija, aerodromi, željeznica? I kako se obezbjeđuju ta sredstva? Drugo je pitanje slično, dakle, nakon što se usvoji zakon u državi, da li se omogućuju izmjene u saobraćajnicama, izgradnji i slično, dakle, postojeće infrastrukture. Evo, nadam se da su pitanja jasna. Evo, možemo opet krenuti od Lize, ako ili, evo. Dakle, ko implementira mjere sanacije i kako se obezbjeđuju sredstva? Evo, to je možda najkonkretnije.
Yes, well, that is where you come back to if a party has the factual and legal rights to do measures. And I would guess that it is quite similar in different countries. You have a certain party that is the responsible for the noise source itself, the road owner or the railway owner, which could be a national administration or a regional administration or a local municipality. And therefore the actions should be at that party. So if, for example, if the National Road Administration are the ones that owns and maintains the roads, they are also the ones that should do the action plans, do the noise mapping, and should do the noise measures and fund the noise measures. So it's a polluter pay principle that the one that are responsible for the noise are the ones that should do the actions. And therefore it could be difficult, for example, if when it's a city or agglomeration doing noise maps and action plans, they can't really, well, they can have some limited availability to industries, for example. So the city can't go up to an industry and build a noise screen, but they have to work with other kind of measures like financial incentives or other kind of regulations to do that kind of measures. So you really need to see how the responsibility for the noise source itself are how they are distributed within the country. But for the main noise sources, which is the infrastructure, it's usually the one that owns and maintains the road or railway that will do the noise measurement, the noise reduction measures themselves. And as for the question about doing changes, that is of course possible. And then it is of course good to have some kind of national or regional regulation on what kind of noise levels should you aim for when you do changes. You can often have a bit higher ambition level when you are doing actual changes in the infrastructure, rather when you just have the same conditions that has been for 50, 100 years. So when you're rebuilding a road or building a new road, you can use that possibility to also build noise screens and do improvements on buildings around the road, etc.
Evo, možda bi bilo interesantno čuti, Viktore, u Rumuniji, ko snosi, hajde tako kažemo, troškove sanacije ili nekih infrastrukturnih zahvata koji su naloženi akcionim planovima, ako sam dobro shvatila.
Like I say in my presentation, we in the past needed to solve some gaps. When I present in my slides some governmental decision which we made in 2020, in 2008, in 2016, these gaps was improved because, like I mentioned in my presentation, in 2005, when we ensured the first transposition of END, we didn't identify very well the authorities which are responsible to make noise map, to make action plan, and to put in application noise abatement measurements which are in the action plans. And for this reason, for example, in 2007, when we make first round of noise mapping, our city halls make noise map and action plan for all noise sources. But after that, we changed this approach and we put the authority which have in an administration the noise sources to make noise map action plan and to put in application a noise abatement measure. For example, our national road company, if have the responsibility to make noise map action plan and to put in application noise management abatement for all major roads which are in administration of this company. If we have major roads which are in administration, for example, city halls or other local authorities, this authority have the responsibility to make noise map action plan and to put in application noise reduction measures. This is the approach. You cannot put to make this noise reduction to put to other authorities. You need to put to the owner of the noise sources. We make this mistake in 2005. Before we become member state, and in 2007, when we make the first noise maps, we didn't prepare for this job, for this reason. Yes, and we change all the legislation step by step in order to harmonize all these gaps, to solve, not to harmonize, to solve all these gaps. And in our country, our authorities which make noise maps, action plan, and put in application noise reduction measures are the authorities which have in administration the noise source. This is the better approach. Other approach, it is a bad approach. But I don't understand the second question. The second question, I don't understand.
Tiče se, ništa, samo tiče se ko snosi troškove saniranja buke. Mislim da ste to već dobro odgovorili, a i Liza je onaj ko zapravo uzrokuje buku. Pretpostavljam, ali to je, samo sam to htjela da potvrdimo još jednom. Evo, možemo prijeći i dalje. Evo, jedno pitanje koje je vrlo često u Bosni i Hercegovini, dakle, koje se može primijeniti, koji će biti problem. Pitanje u vezi nelegalno građenih objekata u blizini nekog izvora buke. Na primjer, modeliranju buke nisu predviđeni ti stambeni objekti, obzirom da su nelegalni. Međutim, kasnije se uspostavi da određeni objekti stambeni postoji, koji se često onda žale na tu buku. To je čest, dakle, slučaj u Bosni i Hercegovini. Ja ne znam, evo, da li ima takvih slučajeva i da li je bilo u Rumuniji. Evo, možda bi bolje bilo da nam Viktor to odgovori. Da li je bilo slučajeva, dakle, kada se prilikom mapiranja nisu uzeli u obzir neki objekti, obzirom da su bili nelegalno izgrađeni, a onda kasnije je ustupio neki pritisak javnosti, obično su to kuće uz neke saobraćajnice, koji su tražili neka prava, ali evo, da li me shvatate?
Yes, okay. In Romania, we had in the past, and we have also now some of this problem. But in the new legislation in 2019, we put the obligation for the city hall to take in consideration noise maps and noise limit when they develop the urbanization of the city. And because they now have this obligation, usually they didn't have the permit to make some residential building in the locations which are with noise problem due to noise road traffic or air traffic. But also in Romania, we are in the beginning of this process. But we put in our legislation, and we find a solution in order to solve this problem.
Hvala, idemo na sljedeće pitanja. Imamo zaista dosta pitanja, evo morat ću priznati da ne znam da li ćemo u ovom zadatom roku moći i odgovoriti na sva, ali ako ne, zamolit ćemo znači i da se postavit ćemo ta pitanja pismeno, pa evo doćemo do odgovora na neki način. Evo pitanje, da li postoje, vjerovatno postoje, i koje su visine kazni, sankcija za prekoračenje nivoa buke u određenom intervalu dana ili noći, na primjer za saobraćajnice, željeznice, ako je prekoračen propisani nivo za industrijsku emisiju buke. Dakle, da nam nešto kažete o iskustvima kada su u pitanju kazneni, dakle, odredbe. Evo, možemo možda sa Lizom krenuti, da li, kakva su iskustva, pa... Jeste li uspjeli?
Sorry, my mobile is a bit slow. Yes, I heard the question. I just couldn't put the sound on. We, in Sweden at least, we don't have any penalties like fines or something if you exceed the threshold values. What can happen is that you will have to finance some kind of measures to reduce the noise, and that can of course be very expensive, or it can be rather cheap depending on the situations, but we don't have any standardized fines for exceeding the values. We have in Sweden, we don't use limit values as much as guideline values, which means that they can often be exceeded a bit without it having without you having to do anything. So it's a bit of a rubber band value that we're using.
Interesantno. Evo, Viktore, kod vas kakva imate iskustva?
Yes, also in Romania we have the same approach. We have threshold values, and the responsibility of the authorities to find some solution in order to reduce the noise. We don't have penalties, but also we have now we work on the new legislation for noise limits. and noise threshold values, and maybe we will have some approach regarding to use noise limits only when the others don't exist solution in order to reduce noise, and we will use this noise limit in order to only for indoor, only to assure the noise limits inside the residential, inside the dwelling. But for outside, we used threshold values and not bad penalties. We make the obligation in the law for the administration of the noise source to find the solution in order to reduce the noise.
Evo još jedno možda povezano pitanje, vezano je sad dakle za monitoring buke. Kako se provodi monitoring buke po akcionim planovima? Dakle, da li se dobro implementiraju akcioni planovi? Kako se vrši taj monitoring buke i ko to provodi i na kraju krajeva ko to finansira? Evo, ako može, ne znam, Liza i Viktor opet, kakva su iskustva?
Well, we have, it's the same party that is doing the noise mapping and doing the action plans that are also responsible for following up the results of the action plans. So we don't have a different administration or something that monitors and follows up the noise. So it's done by themselves.
Yes.
We have da li jednom godišnje neki monitoring ili mjesečno, kako? Evo da to malo otprilike, evo Viktore, možete na vašim primjeru.
Yes,
5 godina.
We have, the noise source administration, the authority which have in administration the noise source have the obligation to put in application the action plan. But we have some responsibility for our environmental agency in order to see if the noise reduction measures which are put in this action plan are put in application. And if are not put in application, we need the local authority, for example, need to put in the future action plan the reason why they don't put in application the noise reduction measure which was established in the past, and which deadline they will have in order to put in application this noise reduction measure. Our local agency have this responsibility to monitoring which noise reduction measure are put in application and which are not put in application, which was mentioned in the action plan.
Hvala na odgovoru. Evo, mislim, mi smo već došli do kraja sa našom agendom. Ja bih zamolila zaista sve učesnike da ostanu evo još 10 minuta pa da odgovorimo još na neka pitanja. Veoma su nam važna ovi odgovori jer evo kao što vidite i kao što znate mi smo na samom početku, evo, da kažemo, usvajanja ovih direktiva, dakle kada su u pitanju buka, pa su nam ta iskustva veoma važna. Dakle, imali smo nekoliko pitanja, pa evo ja ću ih sumirati, ali Charlotte je dosta u svojoj prezentaciji spominjala, ali evo možda još malo kada je u pitanju ranije provedena istraživanja koja se odnose na utjecaj buke u odgojno-obrazovnim ustanovama za zdravlje djece i uposlenika. Na to se Charlotte, koliko ja znam, osvrtala, pa evo ko je postavio pitanje može ponovo da to i pogleda. Bilo bi možda interesantno da nam se kaže koje uobičajeno možda mjere se provode koje se mjere provode upravo u odgojno-obrazovnim ustanovama koje pomažu zaštitu djeci od buke.
Yes, maybe I can start. I guess there are many things that you can do to protect the children from excessive noise levels. I guess you can see that their exposure from the outside, from the traffic or industrial plants or other activities coming from the outside. And then, of course, it is important to have proper insulation of the buildings and good windows, etc., that we have talked about. And if possible, at least parts of the schoolyard should also be shielded from excessive noise to ensure that the children can play outside and get enough restoration and physical activity that they need to perform in the schools. And of course, inside, there are also sounds from the activities going on within the school. And there you can work with the acoustics in the room and reduce noise from any types of equipment and place some other materials on tables and chairs, for example, to reduce the overall noise, both from the children and the activities themselves and also from the outside.
Hvala mnogo na odgovoru, vrlo interesantno. Evo i nama kao primjer za buduće kako da zaštitimo djecu u školama. Evo ja gledam sada po ovim pitanjima šta možemo još izdvojiti ovako da nije nikako obuhvaćeno. Evo možda pitanje od Amara. Koliko je, postavljeno je na engleskom jeziku, ali evo ja ću ga prevesti da mogu svi čuti, a vi ćete čuti prijevod. Koliko je, hajde da kažemo, koliko blisko surađuje Institut Karolinska sa vladom kada su u pitanju negativni utjecaji buke na zdravlje? Da li oni imaju neku savjetodavnu ulogu i da li vlada zapravo finansira istraživačke aktivnosti koje će pomoći bolje razumijevanje negativnih efekata buke na zdravlje? Evo, to je pitanje za Charlotte.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the Karolinska Institute is both a traditional research institution with different research areas covered, but we are also, at least the institute where I work, the Institute of Environmental Medicine, we are also a national agency for environmental and health issues. So in that sense, we are kind of advisory board to different agencies and public in many aspects. And we do get involved in a lot of assignments regarding health risk assessments on noise. So we're often interacting with the national agencies and other authorities in these matters and try to advise what are the best ways to avoid impacts on public health from noise exposure. So we have a lot of exchange, both nationally and regionally within Sweden, and also with regards to EU and WHO. Yes.
Evo ja ću iskoristiti priliku još da postavim još jedno pitanje, a tiče se više eventualno da li znate da li postoje sudski procesi upravo zbog utjecaja buke na zdravlje ljudi. Da li je bilo nekada, da li vi po vašem iskustvu znate, da li je bilo slučajeva pokretanja sudskih procesa određene grupe građana koji su se žalili na pogoršano zdravlje zbog buke. Evo, ne znam koga da odaberem za odgovor, ko može da odgovori, neka se javi, molim vas. Evo, možda Liza da krene, pa da, ako ima i Viktor nekih primjera.
Yes, we have quite a lot of examples where people have complained about noise and taking it to environmental court and wanting to have some kind of measures being made. And we have examples from all kinds of noise sources, road, rail, and industrial, and football, soccer plants, and aircraft, airports, and almost anything you might think of. And we have quite worked out legal preferences for when they can have measures done or not. So that is quite well worked out in the legal system. One example which I think is very interesting is concerning aircraft noise around Arlanda, which is the biggest airport in Sweden. When they wanted a new environmental permit, there was this organization of neighbors in the surrounding areas that went together and demanded that the project that the airport wanted to do, that they didn't want it because it would mean too much noise where they lived. But if the project were to get the environmental permit, they wanted funding to be put aside for research concerning aircraft noise. So there is actually a research center at one of the technical universities in Stockholm doing funding research about aircraft noise due to this environmental process. And that is, I think it's an interesting way to go, where you realize, well, you need to do this change, you need this infrastructure, but we can also use the environmental process to get funding for new research and knowing more about the effects that this kind of noise will have. So it's everything from that rather large scale down to the single homeowner wanting a noise screen outside the garden. So it's quite common.
Yes, Tati. Also in Romania, we have a lot of complaints about regarding noise from restaurant activities, for road traffic, railway traffic, airports. Regarding the major noise sources, our approach is to solve these complaints when the authorities make the action plans. In order to find a solution to solve this compliance, because also these action plans are need to put to public consultation, and public can participate to this to make to the process of the maker of action plans, and then compliance are taken into account. Regarding the other type of noise sources like restaurants or other small activities, this type of our approach is to put this the economic operator to make to find solution in order to solve the problem. And usually city halls have this task in Romania.
Hvala vam zaista na iscrpnim odgovorima. Ja bih sada završila sa postavljanjem pitanja. Mi imamo i neodgovorenih pitanja, zaista, ali ne možemo Pokušat ćemo dakle da na ta pitanja odgovorimo pismenim putem. Ja bih sada samo rekla, zahvalila bi se dakle svim prezentatorima na izvrsnim prezentacijama. Vidim već i u chat opciji da su učesnici vrlo zadovoljni sa današnjim webinarom. Bilo nam je veoma korisno. Ja samo imam još reći da pred nama se nalazi i krajem ovog mjeseca će se održati i 3. sastanak radnih grupa. U radu radnih grupa kao i na ovom webinaru pozvane su kako predstavnici iz institucija, tako i konsultantske kuće. A vidimo dakle iz vaših prezentacija da će imati dosta posla, da kažemo, kako za institucije, tako i za konsultantske kuće u oblasti upravljanja bukom, te će nam ovi zaključci sa ovog webinara biti veoma, veoma korisni. Ja bih se sada zahvalila svim učesnicima i evo, ja se nadam možda ćemo imati prilike održati još neke webinare u sličnoj oblasti u okviru ovog projekta, pa evo vidjet ćemo se tom prilikom. Hvala vam svima i doviđenja i ugodan dan.
Doviđenja. Bye.
Have a nice day. Bye bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.